So what happens when you're on assignment? Like, Anand, do you talk to editors, and Chris, do you talk to reporters while they are there? In other words, is the story sort of shaped on the fly? Like I find sometimes with reporters that they might go in, for example, the story's not quite what they think, or they can't decide between a few main characters, or or numerous other things. Does that happen, or when you go, are you pretty much just immersed in the situation? And Anand, do you want to start again?
Yeah, I think both have happened.
Okay.
Probably in Chris's case, I think the two stories were more formed, would you say, Chris, than
in Kandahar, we talked sort of in between the two
right
chunks of your reporting, right? You'd been arrested and kicked out of Kandahar, and then we talked right before you went back for your second trip, basically.
Right. Yeah. So this is an example. This would have been 2013 or 14, and yeah, I think I'd done part of the reporting, and then we talked it through after that, and I did the second half.
Okay. I'd love to focus a little bit more on your Other Women story, which I think, has gotten a lot of attention, and I think is a bit of a microcosm of, what you do with some of your work. I'm really interested to know more about how, in this case, you interviewed rural women who normally would never talk to a male stranger. How did you get to them? And how did you persuade them to talk to you? And when they did, was it in the presence of anybody else?
Yeah, so this is I had been wanting for years to try to sort of crack this code and get to talk to rural women. I remember I'd lived in Afghanistan for 3 years, and in 2008 to 2011. And while I was living there, sometimes what I would do is I would my friend had a taxi, and I would sit in the back of the taxi, and he would just go and pick people up in the countryside. And often you have women or men or whoever sit in the taxi, and my friend would just start a conversation with them about the war, about what's going on. And these are like not in the areas where most of the reporters are. This is out in the middle of basically where the fighting is. And the things that I would hear really shocked me. It really changed a lot of my perceptions, because I had women saying all sorts of things about wanting the troops out, and hating what the Americans are doing. So from that moment, and I would just sit there kind of mute in the corner listening to what they're saying, not because at that point, if they knew I was a foreigner, I think they would stop talking. So that really kind of laid the seeds for me to get really interested in like what's the story about. And then when the withdrawal was announced in 2021, I had been in touch with some people in southern Afghanistan, and through them I met some of their grandmothers, essentially. And so the restrictions in southern Afghanistan are pretty rigid, except when it comes to elderly women. And so some of these women were able to speak. I spoke to one of them initially, I think over Skype or something, and then eventually when I got on the ground, I was able to talk to some of these grandmothers, in some cases with their relatives around, but in some cases without anybody around. And in some cases, we actually had a partition between me and the person who was talking. And it was through the grandmothers that eventually, after I won their trust a little bit, that they were able to refer me to other women who were younger. And so in that way, I think in the end, something like 30, 35 women, I can't remember the exact number, but there's a large number of women that I was able to interview, and just get their life stories in that way.
And did you do it with an interpreter, or do you speak the language well enough to do it?
I speak the language, although not nearly as well as I used to. It used to be when I was living in Afghanistan, I could like I said, with this in the taxi example, I would just sit and
right. You could actually understand. Yeah.
Where I think but now is a little different. One, because it's been so many years, but two, also, what I really needed some help and guidance in, especially some of the cultural mores, and which sometimes especially because I'm dealing with women, that the person who's with me can phrase in the right way, can put in the right context. And so some of the interviews I had somebody with me, and so they were helping a lot in phrasing things in the right way.
Okay. And have you ever, I think you also spent some time, well, 10 years ago, embedding with the Taliban. How did that happen? How did you get there? And also, did you feel that, how do you maintain enough objectivity when you're embedding with the Taliban, as in presumably that gives you more of a Taliban view into the country? How did that happen?
Well, the point wasn't to, the point was to get the Taliban into the country. That was like,
Yeah.
But the way it happened is, so, when I moved to the country, the biggest kind of gap I felt in a lot of the coverage is we just did not know what was going on the other side, right? There was this huge war going on. A lot of reporters, myself included, were going and embedding with the US troops and getting the American troops' perspective. And so the question was, okay, what is actually happening on the other side? And so it took me a while to figure out how to do it safely. And initially was because I started visiting the main prison in Kabul, where there was some Taliban and Al-Qaeda members who were there. And I kind of, I think for months, went and hung out with them, talked to them, and eventually won their trust a little bit. And, realized that I wasn't a spy. I wasn't working for the CIA. I was basically who I said I was. And so then they connected me with their brothers or cousins or whoever who were out in the field and fighting. So that's how I got to them. And then once I got with them, I was just with them, and one person says it's kind of like local culture. They prize hospitality, etc. So you come and stay at their house, and then they kind of protect you while you're there. And so it gave me a totally different view, obviously, of the conflict.